I fired my janitor for being late, then found out why he was crying. The fluorescent lights of the office hummed, a sterile, relentless sound that usually faded into the background of my busy life. But that Tuesday, every buzz felt like a judgment, a sharp counterpoint to the knot tightening in my stomach. I sat at my desk, the polished surface reflecting my strained face, the numbers on the spreadsheet blurring into meaningless streaks. Outside, the city was waking up, a symphony of car horns and distant sirens. But inside, the air was thick with a silence that felt louder than any noise. I'd been waiting for an hour, my patience worn thin, my carefully constructed schedule already unraveling. It was a small thing, really, just a few minutes past the agreed-upon start time. But for me, it was a crack in the foundation of order I'd built my entire professional life around. My company, a small but growing tech firm, prided itself on efficiency, on punctuality, on a streamlined approach to every aspect of its operation. And I, as its founder, embodied that ethos. I was the architect of this meticulously designed world, and any deviation, no matter how minor, felt like a personal affront, a disruption to the delicate balance I'd so painstakingly achieved. My mind raced, replaying the hurried conversation from the day before. He'd been late then, too, a brief, apologetic nod as he slipped in, barely noticeable. I'd overlooked it then, too busy with a client call, but it had lodged itself in the back of my mind, a tiny pebble in my shoe. Today, however, was different. Today, the pebble had become a boulder. My thoughts, usually sharp and decisive, were a chaotic jumble of annoyance and frustration. I prided myself on fairness, on being a good boss, but also on demanding excellence. And lateness in my book was a clear indicator of a lack of commitment, a disregard for the shared goals that bound us all together. It was, I told myself, a simple matter of accountability. He was paid to be there at 8, and it was 10 past 8. My gaze drifted to the empty doorway of the supply closet, the usual domain of our janitor, a quiet man named Arthur. He was a ghost in the machine, someone whose work was essential but rarely seen, whose presence was felt most strongly in its absence. He'd been with us for 3 years, a steady, unassuming figure who always seemed to be there before anyone else and gone long after. I knew almost nothing about him, beyond the fact that he was reliable, or so I had thought. The thought of Arthur, of his quiet diligence, made my annoyance sharpen into a more defined anger. It wasn't just about the time, it was about the principle. If one person could bend the rules, what was to stop others from following suit? The domino effect was a terrifying prospect for someone who valued control as much as I did. I pictured the ripple effect, a slightly delayed start to the morning cleaning, a missed detail in the office upkeep, a subtle erosion of the very standards I'd worked so hard to establish. It was a slippery slope, and I felt an urgent need to arrest its slide before it gained momentum. My fingers tapped a restless rhythm on the keyboard, each click a small explosion of impatience. I imagined the conversation, rehearsing the stern words I would deliver, the clear, unambiguous message that this behavior was unacceptable. I was prepared to be firm, to be direct, to lay down the law. After all, wasn't that what a good leader did? They made tough decisions even when they were unpleasant, for the greater good of the organization. I told myself it was for his own good too, a necessary lesson in the realities of the professional world. He needed to understand the importance of commitment, of showing up, of respecting the time and effort of those around him. My internal monologue, usually a source of motivation and clarity, had become a justification, a defense of my mounting anger. The silence in the office, broken only by the persistent hum of the lights and the distant city, pressed in on me, amplifying my internal turmoil. I felt a strange mixture of righteous indignation and a gnawing unease, a sense that perhaps I was overreacting, but an inability to shake the feeling that I was in the right. This was a business after all, and business demanded a certain detachment, a focus on results, not on whatever might be causing Arthur to be late. I stood up, the scrape of my chair a sudden jarring sound. The decision had been made, solidified in the crucible of my impatience. I walked towards Arthur's usual work area, my mind already formulating the precise wording. the unyielding finality of my words. The path ahead felt clear, albeit a little cold. I was going to address this decisively, and then I would get back to my spreadsheets, to the order and control that defined my world. I told myself it was just business, just another difficult decision to be made. I convinced myself that my anger was justified, a necessary response to a clear breach of professional conduct. I was so sure of my position, so convinced of the logic behind my impending action, that I didn't for a moment consider the possibility that I might be wrong, that there might be more to Arthur's lateness than a simple disregard for his responsibilities. The weight of my own perceived importance, the burden of leadership, felt heavy on my shoulders, but I was ready to bear it, to make the hard call. My footsteps echoed in the deserted hallway, each one a beat closer to an inevitable confrontation. The air grew cooler as I moved away from the main office, the hum of the fluorescent lights replaced by the faint gurgle of plumbing. I rounded the corner, the dimly lit corridor stretching out before me, leading to the small utility closet Arthur used as his base. I could see the faint glow of his work lamp under the door. I reached for the handle, my hand already forming the sharp, decisive words I intended to deliver. It was a simple message, direct and to the point. His lateness was no longer acceptable, and his employment with the company was terminated, effective immediately. I'd already drafted the email, a curt, professional dismissal that would be sent the moment I returned to my desk. It felt like the only logical course of action, the only way to maintain the standards I'd set for my company, for myself. My mind was a closed loop of justification, a fortress built of efficiency and order. I'd been patient, I told myself. I'd given him chances. But enough was enough. The professional world, I believed, was a place of clear expectations and consequences, and I was merely upholding those principles. I pushed the door open, the squeak of the hinges unnaturally loud in the quiet space. The room was small, cramped, filled with the scent of cleaning supplies and damp rags. Arthur was there, not polishing a floor or sorting supplies, but slumped on an overturned bucket, his back to me, his shoulders shaking. A small portable radio sat on a shelf, playing a soft, melancholic melody. He hadn't heard me enter. He was crying. Not just sniffling, but deep, racking sobs that seemed to tear through him. My prepared speech, my carefully constructed anger, evaporated in an instant, replaced by a sudden, chilling wave of confusion and something akin to fear. This wasn't part of the plan. This wasn't a professional problem to be solved with a disciplinary action. This was raw, human pain, laid bare in a way I couldn't comprehend. My vision blurred, not from emotion, but from the sheer unexpectedness of the scene. The harsh fluorescent light of the hallway seemed to spill into the closet, illuminating Arthur's hunched form in stark detail. His hands were balled into fists, pressed against his eyes, as if trying to physically push away the sorrow that was overwhelming him. The air, moments before thick with the scent of bleach and ammonia, now felt heavy with a profound sadness. I stood frozen in the doorway, a trespasser in a moment of intense personal grief. The efficiency, the order, the carefully calibrated world I inhabited suddenly felt flimsy, insignificant, utterly irrelevant. My internal monologue, which had been so loud and self-assured just moments before, fell silent, leaving a gaping void filled only by the sound of Arthur's quiet, desperate weeping. I saw the worn fabric of his uniform, the frayed edges of his trousers, the way his shoulders trembled with each sob. He was not just an employee, not just a statistic in my company's operational efficiency. He was a person who was hurting, deeply and inexplicably. The anger that had propelled me down the hallway dissolved, leaving behind a hollow ache, a dawning realization of my own profound ignorance. I had judged him, condemned him, based on a few minutes of lateness, on a superficial understanding of his role. I had seen a problem to be solved, a disruption to be corrected, and had failed utterly to see the human being behind the perceived infraction. My carefully constructed world of logic and order had shielded me from the messier, more complicated realities of other people's lives. I took an involuntary step back, the floorboards creaking beneath my weight. Arthur flinched, his crying momentarily subsiding as he became aware of my presence. He didn't turn around, but his body tensed, a cornered animal bracing for a blow. The radio's melody, which had seemed merely sad before, now felt like a lament, a soundtrack to his despair. The stark contrast between my internal state of righteous indignation and his external display of overwhelming sorrow was a chasm I couldn't bridge with words. I felt a flush creep up my neck, a deep, mortifying embarrassment at my own callousness. I had been so quick to judge, so eager to enforce my rules, and now, faced with the undeniable evidence of his suffering, I felt utterly exposed, my own perceived strength crumbling into dust. The image of him, a solitary figure consumed by grief in a sterile utility closet, was seared into my mind. It was a moment that would irrevocably alter the lens through which I viewed the world, a moment that stripped away my assumptions and exposed the fragile, often cruel nature of my own judgments. I had come to deliver a dismissal, to enforce a consequence, but instead, I had stumbled upon a truth far more profound and devastating than I could have ever imagined. I stood there, a silent witness to his pain, the words of dismissal catching in my throat. The harsh reality of his suffering was a physical blow, knocking the wind out of me. My carefully constructed edifice of professional detachment crumbled, revealing the hollow core of my own superficial understanding. I saw not a lazy employee, but a man drowning in a sorrow I couldn't fathom. My anger, so potent moments before, now felt pathetic, misplaced. It was a tiny, insignificant spark against the inferno of his grief. My gaze fell upon a small, worn photograph tucked into the side of the radio. It was a picture of a young woman, her smile radiant, her eyes full of life. Next to it, a wilting bouquet of flowers. A wave of understanding, sharp and painful, washed over me. This wasn't about a missed clock-in. This was about a life interrupted, a love lost, a world shattered. My own professional anxieties, my rigid adherence to schedules and deadlines, seemed absurdly trivial in the face of this profound human tragedy. I wanted to apologize, to offer comfort, but the words felt inadequate, clumsy. How could I, who had just minutes before been ready to cast him out, possibly offer solace? My instinct was to retreat, to pretend I hadn't seen, but some unseen force held me rooted to the spot. My own carefully cultivated world of order and control felt like a fragile illusion, easily shattered by the raw, untamed reality of human experience. I noticed for the first time the faint tremor in Arthur's hands as he eventually lowered them from his face, revealing red-rimmed eyes and a deeply etched grief. He looked up, startled to see me, his face a mask of shame and raw vulnerability. He didn't speak, but his gaze, filled with a profound weariness, held more than enough explanation. It was the look of someone carrying a burden far heavier than any missed shift. I saw the silent plea in his eyes, not for his job, but for a moment of understanding, a flicker of compassion in a world that seemed determined to judge him. My heart ached with a feeling I rarely allowed myself to experience: empathy. It was a raw, uncomfortable sensation, a stark contrast to the clean lines of my business logic. I finally found my voice, but the words that emerged were not the stern pronouncements I had prepared. They were hesitant, quiet, stripped of their former authority. I simply said his name, a soft utterance that seemed to hang in the air between us. Then I turned and walked out, leaving him to his grief, but carrying a piece of it with me. The walk back to my office was a journey through a newly discovered landscape. The fluorescent lights now seemed harsh and unforgiving, the hum a mocking reminder of my earlier blindness. The spreadsheets on my desk looked like meaningless hieroglyphs, devoid of any real significance. I sat down, not to work, but to process the overwhelming weight of what I had witnessed. My decision to fire Arthur was no longer a logical conclusion, but a cruel, thoughtless act. The anger had been a shield, protecting me from the uncomfortable truth that the world was not always neat and orderly, that people's lives were complex and often fraught with pain. I realized with a sickening clarity that my pursuit of efficiency had made me blind to the very humanity I was supposed to be leading. The photograph on the shelf, the wilting flowers, they were not just objects, but symbols of a love that had been, a life that was now a memory, and I, in my haste to enforce my sterile rules, had failed to acknowledge the profound impact of that loss. The consequences of my judgment were not just professional. They were deeply personal, a stain on my conscience. I felt a profound sense of shame, a burning regret for my callousness. I had seen a problem and applied a simplistic solution, failing to consider the intricate web of circumstances that shaped another person's life. The encounter had shaken me to my core, forcing me to confront the limitations of my own perspective and the potential for harm in my unexamined assumptions. I picked up the phone, my hand trembling slightly, and dialed Arthur's number. It was a direct line I'd found on his emergency contact form, a detail I'd barely glanced at before. My intention was clear: to rescind my decision, to offer him his job back, to try and mend the damage I had wrought. But as the phone rang, a deeper understanding began to form, a realization that simply offering his job back wouldn't be enough. It wouldn't erase the humiliation, the pain, the feeling of being discarded when he was at his lowest. True redemption, I knew, wouldn't come from a hasty apology or a policy reversal. It would require something more, something that acknowledged the depth of his suffering and my own failure. I heard a hesitant voice answer, Arthur's voice, rough with unshed tears. I didn't launch into my prepared speech. Instead, I spoke quietly, honestly. I told him I had made a mistake, a terrible mistake. I explained that I hadn't understood, that I had been wrong to judge him so harshly. I offered him not just his job back, but my sincere apology, a genuine expression of regret for my insensitivity. I told him I would ensure he had the time and support he needed to navigate his personal grief, that his well-being was more important than any schedule. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, a silence that felt heavier than any words. Then Arthur spoke, his voice still thick with emotion but with a new note of weary acceptance. He thanked me not for the job, but for the understanding. He told me briefly about his wife, about her sudden illness and passing. He spoke of the overwhelming emptiness, the struggle to find the will to even get out of bed, let alone come to work on time. He didn't ask for pity, only for a chance to work through his pain. I listened, truly listened, for the first time. I heard the weight of his sorrow, the quiet dignity with which he carried it. I promised him that he would have that chance, that our company would be a place of support, not judgment for him. The conversation ended not with a resolution, but with a fragile beginning, a shared understanding that transcended the transactional nature of employment. I hung up the phone, the dial tone a low hum in the sudden quiet. The office still hummed with its sterile lights, but the sound no longer grated on me. It was just a sound, a backdrop to the far more significant human drama I had just glimpsed. My perspective had shifted irrevocably. The numbers on my spreadsheets, the efficiency metrics, the pursuit of order, they all seemed to recede, replaced by a profound awareness of the unseen struggles that people carry. I realized that true leadership wasn't about enforcing rules, but about fostering an environment of compassion and understanding. It was about recognizing that behind every employee, every person, there was a story, a life filled with its own joys and sorrows, its own triumphs and its own profound losses. My own pursuit of perfection had made me brittle, unyielding. Arthur's grief, however devastating, had cracked open my carefully constructed world, allowing a sliver of light to penetrate. It was a painful awakening, a humbling experience, but one that I knew would ultimately make me a better leader, a more empathetic human being. The path ahead was no longer about optimizing processes, but about building connections, about recognizing the shared humanity that binds us all, even in the sterile confines of an office. The days that followed were marked by a quiet shift, a subtle recalibration of my priorities. Arthur returned to work, his presence a gentle reminder of the profound lesson I had learned. He was still quiet, still diligent, but there was a new grace in his movements, a deeper understanding in his eyes. He didn't need constant supervision or reminders. He had found his own rhythm, his own way of navigating his grief while still fulfilling his responsibilities. I made sure to check in with him, not as his boss, but as a fellow human being, offering a quiet nod, a brief word of encouragement, a silent acknowledgement of the journey he was on. I learned to observe, to listen, to look beyond the surface of a person's actions, and try to understand the unseen currents that shaped their lives. My interactions with other employees changed too. I became more patient, more understanding, more willing to offer flexibility when circumstances demanded it. The rigid adherence to schedules began to soften, replaced by a more nuanced approach that valued individual well-being alongside professional output. The office itself seemed to transform, the sterile hum of the lights no longer a symbol of cold efficiency, but a gentle backdrop to the complex tapestry of human lives unfolding within its walls. The pursuit of order remained, but it was now tempered with a deep well of empathy, a recognition that true success lay not just in achieving goals, but in fostering a supportive and compassionate environment. My own internal landscape had been reshaped, the sharp edges of my judgment softened by the warmth of understanding. The experience with Arthur had been a painful catalyst, an unexpected encounter that had shattered my illusions and forced me to confront the limitations of my own perspective. It was a reminder that the most important lessons are often learned not in boardrooms or through strategic planning, but in the quiet, unexpected moments of shared human vulnerability. The world, I now understood, was not a series of problems to be solved, but a collection of stories to be heard, of lives to be understood, of hearts to be touched. The memory of his tears, the photograph on the shelf, the wilting flowers, they were etched into my consciousness, not as a source of guilt, but as a constant reminder of the profound interconnectedness of all human experience. The weight of my previous certainty had been replaced by a quiet humility, a recognition that true strength lay not in judgment, but in compassion. The professional world, once a landscape of clear rules and predictable outcomes, had revealed itself to be a far more intricate and emotionally charged space, a place where empathy was not a weakness, but the ultimate measure of leadership. The hum of the office lights no longer felt like a judgment, but a steady, comforting presence. The greatest strength is found not in our certainty, but in our willingness to question it. The initial shock of Arthur's quiet devastation had begun to recede, replaced by a persistent, gnawing discomfort with my previous operational philosophy. It wasn't just about Arthur anymore. It was about the broader implications of a system that prioritized efficiency over humanity. I started noticing other subtle signs I'd previously overlooked. The forced smiles of colleagues enduring personal hardships, the hushed conversations about family emergencies, the way certain individuals seemed to carry an invisible weight that impacted their daily output. These weren't simply statistical anomalies to be managed. They were indicators of deeply human experiences that my rigid framework had rendered invisible. Consequently, I began to actively seek out alternative management strategies, delving into literature and case studies that championed a more empathetic approach to leadership. I discovered concepts like psychological safety, the idea that employees need to feel secure enough to be vulnerable, to admit mistakes, and to express their authentic selves without fear of reprisal. This was a radical departure from my previous belief that a clear hierarchy and unwavering adherence to protocol were the cornerstones of a productive workplace. Furthermore, I started implementing small, deliberate changes. Instead of immediately addressing performance dips with disciplinary measures, I began initiating private conversations, framed not as interrogations, but as genuine inquiries into well-being. I learned to ask open-ended questions, to listen without interrupting, and to offer support rather than judgment. For instance, when Sarah in marketing, usually a powerhouse of creativity, began missing deadlines, my old impulse would have been to issue a formal warning. Instead, I scheduled a coffee meeting, ostensibly to discuss an upcoming project. During our conversation, I gently steered the discussion towards her general well-being, and she eventually confided about her mother's escalating illness and the constant stress of juggling work and caregiving responsibilities. Building on this, I worked with her to temporarily adjust her workload and explore flexible working arrangements, an approach that not only retained a valuable employee, but also fostered a deeper sense of loyalty and trust. Conversely, I recognized that this shift wasn't about abandoning accountability altogether, but about redefining what accountability truly meant. It wasn't about punishing perceived failures, but about creating an environment where individuals felt empowered to communicate challenges proactively, knowing they would be met with understanding and collaborative problem-solving. Another crucial layer is the understanding that fostering empathy isn't a one-time initiative. It's an ongoing commitment that requires consistent effort and a willingness to adapt. It's about weaving these principles into the very fabric of the company culture, from onboarding to performance reviews. Now, consider how this applies when you face a team member who consistently arrives late but is otherwise an exceptional contributor. Instead of focusing solely on the lateness, explore the potential underlying reasons, perhaps a challenging commute, family responsibilities, or even a personal health issue that they're hesitant to disclose. By approaching the situation with curiosity and a willingness to understand, you might uncover a solvable problem and retain a valuable asset, rather than losing them due to a rigid, one-size-fits-all policy. This nuanced approach acknowledges that human beings are complex, and their performance is often influenced by factors far beyond the scope of their job description. The initial shock of Arthur's quiet devastation had begun to recede, replaced by a persistent, gnawing discomfort with my previous operational philosophy. It wasn't just about Arthur anymore. It was about the broader implications of a system that prioritized efficiency over humanity. I started noticing other subtle signs I'd previously overlooked. The forced smiles of colleagues enduring personal hardships, the hushed conversations about family emergencies, the way certain individuals seemed to carry an invisible weight that impacted their daily output. These weren't simply statistical anomalies to be managed. They were indicators of deeply human experiences that my rigid framework had rendered invisible. Consequently, I began to actively seek out alternative management strategies, delving into literature and case studies that championed a more empathetic approach to leadership. I discovered concepts like psychological safety, the idea that employees need to feel secure enough to be vulnerable, to admit mistakes, and to express their authentic selves without fear of reprisal. This was a radical departure from my previous belief that a clear hierarchy and unwavering adherence to protocol were the cornerstones of a productive workplace. Building on this newfound understanding, I started implementing small, deliberate changes. Instead of immediately addressing performance dips with disciplinary measures, I began initiating private conversations, framed not as interrogations, but as genuine inquiries into well-being. I learned to ask open-ended questions, to listen without interrupting, and to offer support rather than judgment. For instance, when Sarah in marketing, usually a powerhouse of creativity, began missing deadlines, my old impulse would have been to issue a formal warning. Instead, I scheduled a coffee meeting, ostensibly to discuss an upcoming project. During our conversation, I gently steered the discussion towards her general well-being, and she eventually confided about her mother's escalating illness and the constant stress of juggling work and caregiving responsibilities. Consequently, I worked with her to temporarily adjust her workload and explore flexible working arrangements, an approach that not only retained a valuable employee but also fostered a deeper sense of loyalty and trust. Conversely, I recognized that this shift wasn't about abandoning accountability altogether, but about redefining what accountability truly meant. It wasn't about punishing perceived failures, but about creating an environment where individuals felt empowered to communicate challenges proactively, knowing they would be met with understanding and collaborative problem-solving. Another crucial layer is the understanding that fostering empathy isn't a one-time initiative. It's an ongoing commitment that requires consistent effort and a willingness to adapt. It's about weaving these principles into the very fabric of the company culture, from onboarding to performance reviews. Now, consider how this applies when you face a team member who consistently arrives late but is otherwise an exceptional contributor. Instead of focusing solely on the lateness, explore the potential underlying reasons, perhaps a challenging commute, family responsibilities, or even a personal health issue that they're hesitant to disclose. By approaching the situation with curiosity and a willingness to understand, you might uncover a solvable problem and retain a valuable asset, rather than losing them due to a rigid, one-size-fits-all policy. This nuanced approach acknowledges that human beings are complex, and their performance is often influenced by factors far beyond the scope of their job description. The sterile, predictable environment I had once cultivated now felt insufficient, even detrimental, as it failed to account for the messy, unpredictable, yet ultimately vital human element. The lessons learned from Arthur, Sarah, David, and countless others have reshaped not only my approach to management, but also my fundamental perception of what it means to lead. It's a continuous process of learning and adaptation, a commitment to seeing beyond the immediate performance metrics and recognizing the intricate interplay of personal circumstances and professional contributions. The sterile predictability I once craved has been replaced by a dynamic engagement with the messy, unpredictable, yet ultimately enriching reality of human interaction. This ongoing evolution is not about abandoning accountability, but about redefining it, moving from a system of punitive measures to one that fosters growth, encourages proactive communication, and celebrates shared resilience. The true practice begins now, in the daily commitment to extending understanding, fostering psychological safety, and recognizing that the most impactful achievements are often born from a foundation of genuine compassion and unwavering support for the human spirit. The journey continues, not towards a destination of perfect order, but towards a more profoundly human and ultimately more effective way of building